Yeah, cool. I was brought up Catholic, so I was baptized as an infant. Um, and in the Catholic Church, because you taught infant baptismal regeneration, it also then was taught you have a relationship with God, you are connected with God, even though there's no call to really respond to the gospel, or an understanding of the gospel, or teaching about uh, a clear teaching about what it meant for Jesus. I always believe that Jesus died for my sins, but had no idea what that meant. Um, and so when I actually uh, embraced the gospel in my late teens into a Pentecostal, you know, community, um, one of the things I saw as one of the big problems with the way I was raised was my infant baptism. I actually connected. I said, that's it. So I actually hated infant baptism initially, and went, that's clearly, so that's the problem, is it raises people to never have, they're already in, so they never taught to respond to the gospel. And so, that's a big problem, and here's this community that teaches you, no, you have to come to the gospel, repent and believe, be baptized. And then this community also taught, and then down the track, be baptized in the Holy Spirit, and the proof of that will be that you speak in tongues and all this sort of that, or that added stuff as well. But yeah, it was like, it just seemed really clear and obvious to me. And then I went to university and got involved in an organization called the Australian Fellowship of Evangelical Students. A really good, and their campus groups called Christian Union. And these guys taught me how to read the Bible. They taught me how to actually understand the gospel. They taught me good theology, and it was just like night and day. And I remember going back to the little Pentecostal church, and I spoke to the minister going, do you think maybe we could preach through books of the Bible, rather than just, he was a lovely guy too, and he went, oh no, I think people like the sort of preaching I do. And it's like, okay. And so I was really being taught meat, when I've been taught milk for a while. And then but there was all these Presbyterians and Anglicans involved in this group, and they believed in infant baptism. And it totally blew my mind. I was like, wait a minute, but that's like the big problem with the Catholic Church. How on earth do these people who teach the Bible way better than my Pentecostal friends, and way better than the Roman Catholic Church, and yet they believe in what these Roman Catholics believe? And so I went, I have to get my head around this, because this is totally baffling to me. So I searched for something that would explain a good Reformed evangelical position on infant baptism, and why it wasn't the same as Roman Catholic understanding, and why it wasn't just a hangover from the part of the Reformation that they haven't gotten rid of or something. Now, what's their real reason? And I found an article, and I have no idea where that article is, or what it even said. I can't recall. But what it did for me, it didn't actually convince me. It just said, okay, so there are these two valid positions, and I still lean to credo baptism. I still thought the idea of being baptized is this visceral feeling. You can remember your physical baptism of water, and that's however it was done. It was still seemed like this physical experience that you wanted people to remember. And that felt as a compelling reason for me for credo baptism. And so I went, but no, there's good. Okay, they've argued a good biblical case. I'm not going to worry about whether they're right or not. I just settled that for me a little bit, that there's two good sides. And I sort of relaxed about it until I had a child on the way. And that's the problem. And I describe it a bit like throwing a ball up in the air and then trying to read and understand as much as you can. And there's only a sort of limited amount of time you've got before the ball lands, and it's got to land somewhere. Because if you go, I'm if you delay, you can't infant baptize your 25-year-old child, right? So if you delay, you've chosen a side, and I think if I became a believer, and I had teenage children, I would say the Credo Baptist position for them. I wouldn't baptize them.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, partly I would call them to be baptized. I would say we are being baptized. This is a family now. I would give them that same ideas, but I do think you can't. There is a certain age in which you obviously become a child to the same thing you would call someone from who walked off the street who wanted to be baptized. You call them to own their faith. And when you've got someone at a certain age, and even if my daughter was 7 and I hadn't gotten baptized, I wouldn't want her to do it unwillingly. There's nothing worse than dunking a child that's screaming, please no, right?
Running around with the spray bottle.
That's why I'm pouring it like, get off me! I don't believe any of this crap. Like, no one wants that experience for their child, right? But the so I think what was I saying? So I decided that so I looked into you have to decide eventually.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to come to a decision, and so that's when I had thought both sides had good arguments. So I was in this position where I could go either way. When I became a member at my Presbyterian church, they asked me if I wanted to be baptized again or to embrace my my infant baptism in the Catholic Church as my baptism. Okay. And so they would have been okay with me. Well, they would have gone, it's not, the first one wasn't a genuine baptism because it was in the Catholic Church. If I was baptized as a Presbyterian, they probably wouldn't have that position. But because they said, look, do you want to get baptized again or not? And I decided, I think I went, the symbol of baptism, that even though it was in the Catholic Church, and even though they believed I was regenerated because of it, it's still part of this grand tradition of baptism, this beautiful tradition of baptism in Christendom, right? And that the picture of baptism, that picture became true. The symbol, now that I believe of baptism as a symbolic act, right? Whether you believe it should happen after faith or before, right? I still go, okay, well, if I don't think of it as a magic thing, I think of it as a symbolic thing, then that symbol came true. Now I'm experiencing the reality that symbol was pointing to. And so I didn't feel, as you did, compelled to get baptized, but I wasn't railing. Like, I understand that compulsion. I wasn't railing against Christianity, so I didn't feel like I needed as dramatic an expression. But it wouldn't have been a problem if I did. But yeah, for me, I went, okay, I'm embracing the symbol of this thing became a reality, and that's a beautiful thing. That the reality has come full circle. So that was my, as imperfect as it was, that was my baptism. And so then I had to grapple with all the different arguments and listen to as much as I could from both sides, with sort of a leaning still to credo baptism. But I think the thing that compelled me was actually, and it sounds a bit silly, but a narrative, the idea of a story of a father raising their children in the Jewish faith, longing for the disciple, that thing that I've sort of talked about. And then in Acts 2, hearing about these preachers, and they're coming along, and he's just in there in the crowd with these children. I'd like probably a whole nother discussion, but I'm enjoying watching The Chosen.
Oh, wonderful.
And there's lots of potential problems with it, but there's lots of beautiful things in it. My wife and I are loving watching it. And one of the beautiful things I love is how much they're representing the Jewish faith as they were longing for the Messiah, and they're teaching, they all were brought up longing for them, and it was just part of their identity. And seeing, and again, it probably comes back to what is baptism, but seeing baptism as an embracing of the Messiah, being baptized into his name, that it for me it rang so true that he would just sweep his whole family up. And is this what you do to embrace the Messiah? Well, let's go. And he'd sweep his whole family up, and they would all be baptized, and his children would be baptized, and his teenage kids would be baptized, and his wife would be baptized in it, and his infant in his hand would be baptized, and they would all be baptized into, because it wasn't this test of are you saved, therefore you get the tick of being baptized. It was this embracing of the thing that they'd longed for generations and generations, that finally the Messiah had come. And that story, this imaginary story really, was a great argument. But I wrote this story, and I left it unended, as to what did he do with his kids. I left it sort of, like the prodigal son sort of story, parable of, we don't know whether the brother comes into the party. I was like, I left it, and I just left it hanging to go, what rings true about what he would have done. And for me, and the people who go, it's covenantal theology and stuff like that, all those sort of arguments, I was getting frustrated by both sides of the arguments because they were so complex. And I, to some degree, wanted peasant theology. Like, I wanted, what did the average farmer understand, and what would he have done? And how the more complex you make it, the more I started going, you're sounding like you're setting up a whole picture to support your argument. I just wanted to go, what would they have done in the first century? And looking at church history, it didn't overly help, because you don't get too many references to baptism at all in the first few hundred years. But you do get references really early on that people were baptizing infants. Like, that seemed to be a normal part of common practice, but also lots of bad theology crept into the church. So if I wanted to argue against using a historical argument, like, Augustine, there's pros and cons with what Augustine taught, and Augustine says that baptism was there since the time of the apostles. And you've got these one wacky guy, the earliest reference I could find was this one guy who says you shouldn't baptize infants, as everyone is sort of doing, because you never know. And you also shouldn't get married. You're like going, oh, wait a minute. So is he a good argument for? But what he does express is that it was
happening if he's arguing
happening, right?
Sure.
And so the question is, what would you expect from each position? Because we don't have explicit. What would you expect to find both in the New Testament and in history? And I think one thing I would expect to find, if infant baptism is correct, you would expect to find people who get baptized and references to their households getting baptized. You'd expect to find that, unless they didn't have households. It doesn't mean that's a sell-out argument, because you could go, there's no, but that's what you'd expect if that side is true. You'd expect that children in the church, in the epistles, are always referred to as in the community. There's no division between those who are not baptized yet and those who are. There's no children would just be included in the promises, in the language, being raised in the faith, being obey your parents in the Lord. All these sort of, that language would be there. Or at least if you didn't have that, if you had the system that many Baptist churches have today, you would expect to find evidence of that being referred to. So the idea of we wait until there's a age of what's the term, the
accountability,
age of accountability, and then you do a course, and then you do do this, and then you do and then when we celebrate a child coming of faith in their teen years, children who have been raised in Christian households, but we don't see that. You'd also expect the debate being raging if the argument was your children were included in the covenantal sort of family ideas, but now they're not. You'd expect some issues, people being wanting to bring their children and being returned away. You'd expect that debate going on, clear teaching that no, you shouldn't baptize your child. So often the argument is, where's the clear teaching to baptize your child? And I would say, not as just a joke, well, where's the teaching to not? I would say that the expectation would be that we would bring your children, and I'd be fine if they said, actually, no, that's not appropriate yet. But you'd expect to see examples of that. Now, all these things are incidental, like they're, but the picture I see going back to that farmer theology, that peasant, and he's raising his family, and I want to be part of that. I want to be part of that story of someone who raised their